Hello, UATV is online, and in the air we are here. We actually wanted to discuss precaution is death, but you know that, so we changed the topic. Now the topic is the inadequacy and hypocrisy, right? Julia is with me, and Serhi.
Western hypocrisy.
Western hypocrisy. Talk us through the thing.
Well, so there is quite a bit of an issue with how the West looks at Ukraine in a very unique way, right? Like Ukraine is special, but we're not special in a way where we are granted special things. We're special in a way where, on the contrary, everyone looks for very special excuses to not give us things. So one of these things is NATO. It's a NATO membership. There is a lot of deliberation in Western societies as to whether it's going to change anything, and also if it were to happen during the war, how would that look like? If Article 5 could be used, and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the biggest sort of adversaries in opinion as to accepting Ukraine into NATO is that we can't do that because Ukraine cannot define its borders currently.
What does it mean? So, if we define the borders, say tomorrow, so then?
Then what? Then if we just say that, okay, well, we're asking NATO to protect just this particular bit, right? Okay. Then the Ukrainian population would be upset because then we're excluding all of the parts of Ukraine that are occupied. But at the same time, like, it could be a contingent membership, right? Based on like a contingency that once an area gets deoccupied, it gets added to the bunch.
You say so.
Yeah, so it doesn't...
Is that possible, politically, economically?
I mean, it should be possible politically, economically, and militarily, because it's not like we liberate a whole oblast at a time, right? So it's not like it adds a huge chunk. It's sort of like it comes very gradually.
Is it partial membership into NATO? Is that...
Well, a partial membership into NATO should be possible because we are living in a world where we are literally in World War III, yet no one wants to admit it. But I mean, I keep saying it because we should just deal with it. That's what it is. It's just we imagine World War III as trenches everywhere around Europe and the United States and everywhere else, but it isn't. Like, we're in 2024. It's drone warfare. It's informational warfare.
The war is onwards right now.
Yeah, so the war is going on, and it's all major political powers against each other, but I digressed quite a bit here. Okay. I think the point here is that like the conditions in which we accept countries into NATO have been created 100 years ago in a completely different environment. While we live, again, in 2024, we are in World War III. NATO is created to keep world peace. They're quite failing at doing that, right? And they're failing at...
Well, all the organizations around the world are a little bit, like, outdated.
They're outdated and they're hypocritical. Like, look at the UN. Russia is the biggest aggressor in the world, undoubtedly, right now, and Russia chairs the UN Security Council. Like, it's absurd.
I love that.
It's surreal.
It's surreal, absolutely.
Absolutely surreal. And Ukraine has to submit what paperwork to Russia about Russian war crimes.
And they're like, all right. I mean, it's comedy show, a bad one.
It's like watching Mr. Bean, you know, it's really bad comedy.
Backwards.
Backwards, literally. Like, it's like living in a Simpsons episode. I mean, I can give so many SNL skit, like there's so many examples, but it's a real life dystopia.
My question, if I may, what can we do about it here in Ukraine? As a journalist, all right? If not, we were like into big high chairs in NATO, whatever. Right now, you and me, can we do something about it as a journalist? Raise the awareness, whatever.
With international organizations, well, unfortunately, I don't think so. Because it's some kind of procedures, and we know that, for example, UN don't like to change it, to reform some such questions.
So what? I mean, let's change it without any procedures.
I think it's because people don't push enough, right? I think the one thing that journalists can do is one of the things that I did notice, at least in the US, because most of my experience is coming from the US, right, is that if we make the people believe something and if we make the people want something, the people are going to be the driver of change. So as we know, the American population is usually what drives the most change in NATO and in a lot of policy making because, well, hey, America is one of the world superpowers. I think that the American population is also not very aware of history, unfortunately. I've gone through that educational system, and it is not great. So how about we define what NATO standards were like in 1955, in which country...
1955.
Yeah, almost 100 years ago.
Exactly. Let's wait for another 20 years. And
but for
100 years, this century.
But for some reason, you know, those standards of not being able to define territory didn't apply in 1955, but now they apply in 2024. So there was a brief moment in history where Germany joined NATO for the first time, and Germany wasn't what we know Germany as today. It was West Germany and East Germany, East being occupied by Russia, which is, by the way, you know, the not 1 inch to the east situation. That was actually about NATO inching into East Germany, not actually into Russia.
But as I remember, it was a demarcation of border between East and Western Germany. So Western Germany, they had borders,
We have borders too.
but not
No,
all.
we can't. You mean Ukraine? We
Yeah.
can't define our borders. That's the reason why we're not in NATO. If we, I mean, so you're saying we can't because we can't do anything about it because there are procedures. Julia says that we're not, we're not pushing hard enough.
Yeah, we shouldn't be bound by outdated procedures, right? Like, so let's say we can define Ukraine's borders. We can. The borders of 1991 are Ukraine's borders, but parts of these borders are occupied, same as East Germany was considered the occupied part of Germany. It wasn't necessarily considered a separate entity, like they knew that they wanted to acquire that part of Germany at some point, right? But let's say we take that out of the account at all. Ukraine is not necessarily asking for Article 5. The one reasoning for why we can't define the borders is Article 5. We want a consistent supply of weapons, and we want a guarantee that no one is going to come to us one day and be like, you know what? Sorry, guys, we're not interested anymore. We're just going to stop doing it. If we are in NATO and if we have the commitment of NATO, then we know that we can continue asking for weapons. We can continue receiving them. As for Article 5, we can define areas that are beyond the gray zone, that are protected by NATO, which means Russia is not going to be so keen on striking them, because that now does bring Russia into war with NATO, and that will help us liberate the rest of our territory, because we're not going to have to think about Russia doing incursions onto the parts that are not invaded yet.
You say are you saying that the people are the driver of all the changes?
Yeah.
American people. We're talking about American audiences
Yeah.
here. All right. So, how do we talk with them? How do we educate them? What do we do?
Well,
What would you do?
I would explain to American people that Russia is a big paper tiger that continues drawing red lines that they do not adhere
Say it
to,
again,
and
say it
that
again.
and that the whole concept of World War III and the poor world suffering of World War III is a bit it's a bit too late, a little too late, a little too little, because we are already there, and the only way of avoiding the World War III that people are so scared of by pushing Russia is by giving Ukraine what Ukraine needs. And I think that there are just not enough journalists worldwide kind of honing in on that concept. Because,
Well, maybe I am wrong, but hopefully I'm not. So maybe Josep Borrell says something about peacekeeping and weapons that are coming into Ukraine that will help peacekeeping. You just showed me that.
yeah, there is actually...
Is that encouraging at all or not?
It is very encouraging. Actually, Joseph Borrell recently, and by recently I think yesterday, said that, we should take off the limitations of Ukraine as to striking into Russia in order to help the peacekeeping missions. I think that people have this misconception that pacifism means that you are not supposed to give people weapons because the war is going to stop if you don't have weapons. But the war is not going to stop. It's like active warfare is going to stop, but the torture of Ukrainian civilians in occupied territories isn't. And pacifism kills. Like
Absolutely.
before this, pacifism is only cool until an army comes into your house and takes all
and
of your
rapes
life away.
women,
Yeah.
kills your family and abducts your children. And then
Yeah.
we talk about pacifism.
But we
then.
have to decide about which organization we are talking about.
The new NATO.
EU or
we
NATO or
exactly.
what?
We're talking about the journalists, we the people. Sorry, like we the people, investing enough effort and pushing hard enough to change all the procedures that are outdated and antique and whatever.
Well, the reason why I mentioned Joseph Borrell, even though he has nothing to do with NATO, he has a lot to do with the EU, right? But the thing is, all of these organizations are connected, and all of these people have a lot of political pool in layman's terms. So the more people with great political pool start mentioning peacekeeping and weapons, the more that becomes like the norm, and the more that becomes like a pop culture notion, right? So giving Ukraine weapons means
right.
peace is a good message to advocate for. Then the next message is talking to NATO and to NATO officials, and I guess specifically to the President of the United States in this sort of context, because let's be real, if we take all of the politics aside, that's the person who decides the most, because that's also the biggest contributor of weapons.
Yeah, well, the person is not, he's not just one person, it's a big team, it's not,
Yes.
and a big political party, and a political party that have problems, all sorts of problems, like starting
Of
from the
course.
border in Mexico,
I mean,
and everything.
I mean,
everything
this is
there.
like very much simplified. Of course, like it's the same as thinking that like Putin is one person that decides everything for Russia, but
Well,
in
that might be
reality,
true.
no.
Okay,
I mean,
In theory,
in theory, but like if Putin were to die today, like it would still be the same thing would still be happening, because one person with one idea cannot continue staying in power with a radical idea unless he has backing, right? Because he would have been toppled a long time ago. So governments don't necessarily work in absolutes. Like Zelensky does not, preside over all of Ukraine. It's his cabinet.
It's a
well, we
brand.
can't compare this.
But in general, but I think that it starts with a very well-crafted message, and the message sent to the masses, because once people start getting used to the message, that's when the message becomes reality. It's the same as the F-16s, the tanks, the javelins supporting Ukraine. All of that at first was a no-go, right? Until it became more and more prevalent in the media, more and more talked about, because we get used to it and it stops being so far-fetched.
But when we talking about, for example, U.S. People in the U.S., they have many problems without NATO, Ukraine. They'll have elections. And
All right, so
I think
what are you
that
suggesting to do?
it's not a suggestion. I'm just talking about when we want people to say reform NATO or kind of like this question have to be important for them, more important.
Waiting
like
for the proper timing is
maybe, but of course we have always talked about it, about this question, about this
to create
problems.
that timing. Exactly. I mean, you just have to you keep on repeating that every time. That's what Julia says. That's the effort, and you
Yeah,
have to
we
know
are
how to talk
repeating,
to
but-
American
Yeah, but,
audience,
you
like the
know-
people with the experience, like Julia, have to talk to America, not like we. All right, okay. But I mean, that's you do. You at least you know what to do, and you
I
have
mean, the thing is, at the end of the day, we got Abrams because of the American people. Because the way that the democracy works in the United States is no congressman actually want to go and advocate for Ukraine unless they're really interested in the cause, like Lindsey Graham per se is, right? The reason why they go and do that is because their electorate is interested in Ukraine.
Of course,
If
we are
Bob and-
creating
So
the necessity.
if
to talk
let's
to.
say we convince 12 Bobs in Oklahoma or Nebraska or
Oklahoma.
anywhere.
All Bobs live in Oklahoma, right?
I mean, I'm just,
All right.
okay, John's or James's or anyone, really. If we convince 12 of them that Ukraine needs this and subsequently the US is going to benefit from it, right? Then they're going to go do their own research and realize, oh, okay, well, that is actually necessary. So what they're going to do is they're going to pick up their little phone and they're going to start blowing up the line of their congressman. And that congressman is going to be forced to start doing something for Ukraine because these voters are, the US democracy is kind of like a blackmail, right? Because you call your representative and you're like, hey man, I'm not going to vote for you if you don't do this. And if enough people do that, they're forced to go actually act on it. So that's what I'm trying to say is that convincing the people, and it works the same way mostly in Europe as well, convincing the people and showing the people why this is necessary for them is going to actually drive the change because these people are going to be blowing up phone lines of decision makers. Because fortunately, even with Trump and all of this stuff, America is still a democracy and America still
Well, that's
decides a
maybe
lot in the
wrong.
world.
To me, it is a sign of it. That's how democracy works. That's the cost of the freedom.
Yeah. Like,
I mean, that's the costly thing, but here, I mean, that's the nation. The nation made the choice. Sorry for that. So,
yeah, it's like, in Ukraine, we got to go out on the street and protest. In America, it's the country of convenience. You just do it from your couch with your phone.
you go and blackmail your
I mean, it's kind of what it is, right?
yeah, right. Well, 10, 12, 15, 20 million of and here we go. I mean, 3 years ago, nobody would ever imagine the F-16s would actually fly Ukrainian skies, right?
Yeah.
So it works, but it more like works like a natural process that Ukrainian journalism and Ukrainian journalists are like very lit. Well, attached to it, but like they're following the process, right?
Yeah.
Not actually creating the event, creating the necessity for these Bobs and Johns and Jameses in Oklahoma because they just don't know how. Maybe they don't speak
Well,
the language.
it's not even that we don't know how, it's we're outnumbered. Like if you look at the New York Times, you look at the Washington
Well,
Post,
that is
big,
true. That
big
is true,
publications,
Julia.
like most of the names on the articles attached to Ukraine are Russian. Because Russia has a lot of money to have sent their journalists to the United States and have, gotten jobs for them in these publications and have given them budget money to sort of succeed and have, put them in good colleges and gave them good connections. So,
Like 20 years ago.
yeah, 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
And these people are established there. Like there are so few journalists in these worldwide publications that are Ukrainian. I will give you a great example of I think either the Telegraph. I just don't want to lie, but so let's say it's one of the biggest world publications. It's very big, it's very well known. We all read it probably every day, right? And there was a job opening for a Ukraine correspondent. And guess what language was not necessary for them to speak?
Ukrainian.
Of course. So that opens the door for literally any foreigner, that opens the door for Russians. And the type of experience that was required off of this Ukraine correspondent was to have worked in worldwide accomplished publications for about 5 to 8 years prior to this. That eliminates most of Ukrainian journalists because most of Ukrainian journalists do not have an experience of working at the Washington Post or at the Telegraph or at BBC. We have experience working for Kyiv Independent or the Kyiv Post or something Ukrainian that is trying to make a name for itself.
Let's
And
start somewhere. Let's start somewhere. Julia, let's apply for that job.
well,
All right, that will be the next. Well, here we go. Let's talk
why
about
don't you apply?
I worked for a very, very, I don't know, it was a couple of months. I was working full time that's another topic of discussion. But you're right. But still, what about the creating that? Is that possible to create that center of interest, to create our own time, our own New York Times here?
Well, I mean, I guess we're trying to, right? But I think the first good step would be to actually call and apply to these jobs and like get out of the box and tell them like, hey, here's my resume and all of this checks out, right?
Right.
Except for this one thing, because up until 1991, we couldn't even travel abroad. And then our government didn't have resources to send our journalists to work at the Washington Post. So you were asking for something that's...
passport, but that's true.
Well,
I mean,
right.
Yeah, you're
Right. You are technically...
I am a
you are
hypocrite, am I?
from NATO, aren't you?
Well, actually, I am NATO here. So I am Latvian. I was born in Latvia for some reason. And I was born and raised there, but also lived quite a time in Berlin, Germany. You know Berlin, that city?
No, never heard of it.
Small
Small
town.
town.
I've heard,
Small town.
yeah.
Near Kyiv, yeah.
East or west?
Yeah,
Which
that's
one?
it. Yeah,
In the
it's
NATO Berlin or outside of the
in
NATO?
the very NATO, Gradam Kudam. So the thing is that what I like about what you're saying is how passionate you're about the thing. And this is really drives me, I want to follow you. All right, so let's do something about it.
Ooh, let's start a Yulia cult.
The pool of, we're making our own pool of journalism, of knowledge. Maybe if people would be, trying to believe that this is possible, trying to reach out to New York Times and try to do something about it. Maybe this is personal just as well. You go out on the streets, you're capable as a nation, Ukrainian nation, to make a revolution. But how come you're not capable to make a revolution in the media, which is very neat? We need that.
Well, because see, like no change or progress ever happens when you follow the rules and you stay within the lines, right? And so that's the thing.
to
If we
break the
keep
rules.
thinking the same way as you were saying, we're never going to change it because
That's
our
right.
goal is to explain to the people and explain to NATO why what they're doing is outdated and no longer applies to the current world scenario, right? But we are bound by these norms and regulations that, again, are 100 years old. And unless we color outside of the lines and unless we scream that, hey, this is just not going to work, and unless we get creative about it, and unless we ourselves believe and change, it's not going to happen. And I know it sounds really poetic, but
I mean, this is very logic. I mean, this is the impersonation of logic to me.
yeah,
Because if these rules just simply are not working, well, we have to new set of rules, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like, think about it. If you were the head of our like international editorial office, right, and something was going wrong, and you really didn't like it, and you kept staying within the norms and rules and trying to change it, you wouldn't be able to.
But breaking the rules, not every time it's a good idea, and world knows it. For example, German Nazis, they broke many rules. That's because these rules so difficult to break. Because many people, they are thinking, oh, well, we don't know where we heading.
All right.
With-
So in terms,
without rules.
I mean, we are offering. We're not just screaming like only screaming. We are giving
Yeah.
them. We are offering them an expertise. Like
Yes,
Julia, with her expertise, and me and you are actually showing why
Yeah,
this is
we
not
have-
working.
we have to
We're not
show.
saying that we. You cannot.
But
You
that's-
can leave that rules to you yourself. These outdated rules. We just need new rules that actually work. This is. I mean, if you don't want to swim, you're gonna just sink. That's it.
But we have to explain why.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because
but
all
that's-
for the explanation. They're talking to people, to audience.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying,
Yeah,
is that
yeah.
we need to explain that, like, for instance, for some reason these rules didn't apply in certain scenarios, like West Germany, right? And also because the world keeps moving, you can't keep standing in the same place and being like, oh, well, this is the procedure under which NATO accepts these countries because this applied 100 years ago.
1955.
Yeah, so we need to explain why in 2024 it's kind of ludicrous, outdated, and doesn't work anymore, and what situation we're finding ourselves in, because we are at the brink of, like, not at the brink, we're kind of like putting our foot in the door of World War III, right? And so it's a whole different time. And I'm sure that people, when they were coming into World War II, weren't sitting there and being like, World War II, so obvious, it's in the air. We are in this situation now where,
They were exactly- they were-
where
they
the
were-
world needs to change, and certain procedures need to change, because if we keep playing by the same rules that were established in World War I, World War II, right? Like, we're never going to defeat Russia. Russia is going to get what it wants. We're never going to, like, the world order is never going to go back to normal, because there is no such thing as going back to normal.
We're going
The world
forward
order
to normal.
the world order needs to go forward into the new normal. And I think that's more of a key factor. It's like, there was a specific commission created in The Hague, in the International Criminal Court, to prosecute specifically Ukrainian war crimes because of how many war crimes Russia is committing. There was not a commission like that before, because that was a necessity based on the current circumstance. So why can't we convince NATO that the necessity based on current circumstance is to show Russia the commitment of NATO to Ukraine, because that needs to happen specifically for Russia to start understanding that this is not just like any other time that they've invaded a country.
When you say Russia, you mean the Kremlin, Putin.
Well, I mean-
his regime. Because if,
What's the difference?
Yeah,
What is
there
the
no-
difference?
There
There
is
is
really
no
no
difference.
difference. Yeah, no, I don't mean the Putin's regime. I mean, I think that there is. You actually asked a good question. How do we convince the world? I think that we as journalists have been trained to speak in particular terms as to not piss people off, because we have to kind of censor
Okay, yeah,
ourselves. And I think that veil needs to come down
absolutely.
a little bit. And that veil is also saying the Kremlin regime, because Russia at this point is all Kremlin regime. We have, like, old ladies on the street saying that, all slur word for Ukrainians need to die, be raped, and, like, be killed. Russia has been brainwashed
From Russia
so
with
much
love.
for so many
As usual.
centuries. When we talk about, Nazi Germany, we think about about 3 generations of people that were really impacted, because that was like our age people during Hitler, the kids, and the elderly, right? Russia has been an empire for centuries. So that imperial mindset of, like, everyone is beneath us has been there not for 3 generations. It's been there for
Like
20,
forever.
30, 40 generations, for 600 years, right? How do you change?
Technically 300 years.
Well, isn't that enough?
But
isn't
yeah,
that enough?
300 years
is enough,
versus,
right?
like, Hitler's reign, right? And, like, of course, there are still people that follow Hitler's ideology, unfortunately, but it's not in masses, right? But in Russia, it's in masses for three centuries, right? That is crazy.
It's a Russian paradigm. That's
Yeah.
why they're living there, and they cherish that.
I guess.
They drive German cars.
Yeah, I guess in
German
order
all
to
the- all
change.
the day of Victory Day, 9th of May.
I
There's
think-
all German and
We
Japanese
can
cars.
repeat you about this.
Yeah.
We can do it again.
Yeah.
We can do it again.
I think that a good consensus and conclusion for this would be is for the world to understand what we're dealing with and in what direction we should look, as we should stop thinking that Russia is the product of Putin and start thinking and knowing that Putin is the product of Russia.
Absolutely,
yeah.
I absolutely
You know.
agree with
The
that.
product of their, we can call it religion of imperialism.
Well,
The
it
Russian
is a
world.
belief. It is faith, nothing else.
Yeah.
I mean, great Russian culture. You know, there's art and artificial, and also there's a great Russian culture. I don't understand this. This is an oxymoron.
It's a cult.
It's a cult, exactly.
It's
So
really a
my name,
cult.
it's shorter version of it. It's a cult. It's a culture of greatness.
Like,
It's
you look
worked
at
on contrary,
Scientology
the
and
other
you
way around.
understand why it's a cult,
True,
right? Why don't you look at Russia and not understand why it's a cult? Because it's so much bigger and it kind of touches everybody in the country, right? But it's fine. That happens too. Nazi Germany was a cult. Make America Great Again is a cult.
It is now.
You
And
know?
the President Trump needs to play it by ear. I'm sorry. Right. Well, you know, so what do we do? I think this is the right moment. Russia is a paper tiger. Is not in any way a juggernaut. No,
No.
it's not. We can defeat it, and that's what we actually are doing. Because with Kyiv in 3 days, Jesus Christ, it's 3 years right now. And
I think-
we pay blood for that.
Yeah. And I guess like when we were talking about what we can do, right, is we need to stop adhering to these standard terms of speaking to the masses, the Western masses, all masses, in like politically correct terms, because we do not live in a politically correct time. I'm not
Can you give
saying
me a high five?
I'm not saying curse on air, but I'm saying, you know, do tell people things the way that they are. Instead of using things like the Kremlin regime, because that's what we have to say, because that's what the West wants to hear, it's you say Russia. You say Russia, the Russian people, and the Russian government, right? When you talk about NATO and their policies, you call them outdated because they are. When you talk about, you know,
Obviously.
the United Nations and Russia being the head of the Security Council, you call it surreal. And you call it
Surreal.
absurd because
Well,
it is.
It is not only in terms of Russia. I was there in the United Nations. I was listening to the speech of Mr. Raisi, of the dictator that died in a helicopter. You know. So the thing is that after his demise, I've seen people in United Nations. They stand up. They stand.
Yeah.
A minute of silence. A minute of silence for someone who hanged people on a construction cranes. All right. So if that is not outdated, then I don't know what is.
Well, because it's politically correct. We are
Let's make
right.
it politically
It-
incorrect.
but that's the point.
Yeah.
I think that the solution to these problems, especially for Ukrainian journalists, is to stop being politically correct. When you see a job where, you know, in the New York Times or at the Telegraph that you qualify for in everything except having worked for the Telegraph or the New York Times for the past 5 to 8 years,
lovely.
you literally apply to the job
Yeah.
and you tell them this is not a reasonable condition. Because if you want a reporter who is familiar with Ukraine in and out, you need Ukrainian to be a requirement, not a bonus language to report
course.
on Ukraine. And you cannot require from a Ukrainian reporter to have worked at the Washington Post for the 5-8 years
When
because
I
we
mean,
didn't have
in
the...
this case, I mean, English is a bonus language because anyway, you would never be a native speaker, but you always can find a native
Yeah,
speaker to check your
exactly.
language, and that's it.
Exactly, but you can't have, you know, you can't be the Telegraph. And I'm sorry if I'm, you know, if I'm giving Telegraph a hard time and it wasn't them, but I'm pretty sure it was. It was a British publication, so you can't be the Telegraph, and you
I know
can't
the
be
guys
looking
there. I know,
for an
James.
export reporter on Ukraine, on the ground in Ukraine, and say that you speaking Ukrainian is a bonus language.
I
Like,
met
it's ridiculous.
well, the two guys from Daily Telegraph in Odessa. Actually, they were missing the train. They chose the wrong train. I saved their lives. You know.
okay,
So,
yeah.
so daily, change the ways already. You know.
You know, here's the thing.
But they are not going to change. We have to be the driver of the change.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying. We
Yeah.
can be the driver of the change if we censor ourselves. And I think
Hmm.
that the biggest issue with the Ukrainian journalism industry in communicating with the West is that we want to be taken seriously, so we censor ourselves. But I think that in order to be taken seriously, we need to stop censoring ourselves.
Forward to new norm.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we need to be the change that we're requiring.
Is it not a beautiful ending for this episode?
Yep.
You
I
seem
think
to be very upset with this episode.
Are you very upset? Did you anyone
Oh, no,
record?
no.
So he's okay. He was online, right? All right. So
If you don't hear from me, he definitely didn't murder me.
all right. So it was a lovely conversation, people. I enjoyed every second of that. And the resume is: if you want to change, you have to be the driver of this change.
Yeah. You want to see change? Be the change.
Be the change. All right.
Do
So here we
something.
go. UATV English is online, was online, and I'm here. Thank you so very much.